Beyond Catastrophe, that is the title of our next presentation on the grand story about God, about the world, and about our existence. Now, with the story of Noah, the world is spiraling toward what we could call the great point zero. This is a crisis situation we encounter in the story, and the reason for this crisis is being stated up front as we read. Now the earth was corrupt in God's sight, and the earth was filled with violence. And God said to Noah, I have determined to make an end to all flesh, for the earth is filled with violence. Now notice here the key word is violence. It's as if this is God's diagnosis, should I say, on the human civilization in this point of time. As far as the story goes, evil has now settled so deeply into human culture and the human personality that humans now look more like, should I call it, self-promoting psychopaths. They are completely devoid of any human empathy. So God is pulling what we could call the cosmic emergency brake. And God's reason for doing it, we repeat one more time, was violence, a culture of violence. Now what happens in the human personality when, should I say, when we end up in the habit of violence, the story does not tell. However, what the preceding narrative tells us is that it all began with what we learned to be the temptation story by the serpent. And it continued with Cain's anger. And it accelerates with Lamech's manifest of violence. And it will climax in a culture of violence. This is the way it is presented in the story. There is a spiraling, should I say, development of this kind of mind and this kind of culture. So let us just assume for a moment that this is a true story. That this situation actually did develop at some stage in the human drama. What should God be doing? Is his actions really so surprising, or is it unreasonable at all? I mean, after all, what will we do when we see the rise of empires of evil in this world? Now, empires of evil, we have learned from history, can only be stopped by a considerable use of force. As we have seen it in the 20th century, in the early part, in the middle part, and now in the early 21st century. The real, should I say, ethical problem that we have with this story is that it flies in the face of our deep optimistic view of the human spirit. It challenges our beliefs that we are inherent good, and it challenges our belief in human progress and improvability. But it's not only the Noah story that is actually challenging this belief. The last 100 years of European and world history is revealing the same story. Our civilization has for the last 100 years several times pulled what we could call the historic, should I say, the historic emergency brake. We fought the First World War, the war to end all wars. And we are still prepared to do so in case. Our policies of deterrence against each other, we have weapons of mass destruction just in case. So to say that the human spirit is not violence is really an overstatement. We are prepared to do it just in case. Now, the problem is that if there is no human agent left, should I say, to stop this kind of evil, if it happens, then what will we do? This is what the Noah story is all about. Only God was left according to that story. Do you really blame him for pulling the emergency brake? For doing what we ourselves are prepared to do in a similar situation? We read, and God said to Noah, I have determined to make an end to all flesh, for the earth is filled with violence, because of them. Now I'm going to destroy them along with the earth. Now, the question is, has there ever really been such a geophysical catastrophe on this planet that almost wiped out all biological life on planet Earth and changed what we should call the life condition or the biosphere? And the simple answer is yes. The geological history tells that story, but you cannot know from the geological layers of the earth if there was any God ever involved in this. Now, this is not what the geological layers will tell us. Now, many theories has been proposed as to when it happened, how often it happened, why such catastrophic events would take place in our historic past. Catastrophes that for periods of time turned this planet into what we could call empty, dark chaos, a destruction of the natural biological life on land, in the sea, and in the sky. There is a geological piece of evidence for such a past catastrophical events. In a chalk and limestone formation in one of the cliffs of Denmark, there are layers of sediments or mineral deposits from asteroid bombardments in the past. The cliff is actually on UNESCO's World Heritage lists as one of the most important geological sites in the world. It's a sediment layer that is actually called the layer of death. This is the event in which they believe that dinosaurs were killed. This is a global catastrophe. It testifies to that. In the Western Hemisphere, that is in the Americas, on the American continents, there are further geological evidence for a huge asteroid crashing into planet Earth in the past. A destructive cosmic event or bombardment that would cause a sudden collapse of the Earth ecosystem and unleash a whole sequence of destructive events, and that would cause what we call super earthquakes, continental breaks up, tectonic movements, mountain formation, volcanic eruptions, and mega tsunamis that we could not even begin to imagine. Evidence of that we find on a global scale in what is called the Great Atlantic Rift that is stretching from the north to the south of the globe, releasing great amounts of dust, heavy metal, cadmium, sulfur, mercury, and carbon dioxide, what we call CO2. Not even speaking about that such asteroid impact could cause what it could cause in terms of superheating of the planets or parts of the Earth, water evaporating up into the atmosphere, sudden cooling when water would fall down in the forms of rain, snow, and ice. It will all depend on how far you are from the point of impact. Placing large part of the Earth in a long deep freeze followed by a slow recovery with many setbacks. Now, the speed by which we can imagine such events would take place would depend on the amount of energy that would be released on the impacts of these asteroids. And the damage it would cause to biological life would depend on the kind of chemicals that are being released in such an impact and the long-term effects on climate. The idea of such a sudden catastrophe is seen in parts of the geological layers of the Earth, and it's not simply a biblical idea at all. However, in the Bible you do have a memory of such a global catastrophe in the past. We read the following: On that day, all the fountains of the great deep burst forth, and the windows of the heavens were opened. The rain fell on the earth for 40 days and 40 nights. Now we have to remember that what we are reading here is what we could call a survivor's perspective. Now, this is not an explanation for why this sudden catastrophe took place. This is a survivor's perspective and not an explanation for what actually unleashed such a catastrophe in the world in the past. But when we read the texts, we get the clear impression that the geophysical order was suffered a sudden collapse, as if the planet was hit hard by some unknown force. A knockout blow that caused a chain of destructive, disruptive events, and any recovery we could imagine would be slow, it would be gradual, potentially with many setbacks over time. Now, geology cannot tell us what God might have done to unleash such a catastrophe. It doesn't tell us that. It doesn't tell us why God would cause such a catastrophe to take place. Not at all. Nothing in the layers will tell you that. How any biological life would survive is not being told either. These are questions that geology cannot answer. Human could only know that part of the story if God eventually told us that this is what he did. And that's exactly what the Noah story is all about. So the believability in that explanation depends on the believability of the entire grand story of the Bible as a whole. Geology cannot answer that kind of question. That advanced biological life would survive in such a situation is in the story given because God gave or God launched what we could call a grand rescue mission that was just as spectacular as the creation event itself. This is the rescue mission that we usually know as the Noah Ark story. But no more about that now. After the great rescue, according to the story, God will begin to issue a long string of promises as we read. I establish my covenant with you. Never again shall all flesh be cut off by the waters of a flood, and never again shall there be any flood to destroy the earth. Apparently it is very, very urgent for God in this situation, according to the story, that humans should be assured that they don't need to live in fear of another catastrophe of that kind. In other words, God issues a whole string of pledges, promises, as we can read here. Here it is. As long as the earth endures, seed time and harvest, cold and heat, summer and winter, day and night shall not cease. This is a promise that a later prophet in the biblical story will talk about, and he calls it my covenant with day and night. It's the one from the Noah story. A promise that God will later refer to in a speech to the prophet Jeremiah, where he talked about his covenant, which he called my covenant with day and night. This, of course, is the one from the Noah story, which affirms that the Noah event, the flood story, was about a complete system failure for whatever reason. Now, God's next stage or next stop in the story is to repeat the creation mandate to Noah. And here it is. God blessed Noah and his sons, and he said to them, be fruitful and multiply and fill the earth. Now, if you have been Noah or his family, and you have been present, hearing God speak like that, what would you have heard? You would have heard that God has no plans of abandoning his intentions for creating this world. He has not given up on this world. Notice the word blessed. The first time you hear that word is actually in the creation story, in connection with exactly the promise or the mandate to be fruitful and multiply and fill the earth. And it basically stands for what we could call God's active approval and clearly signals that one day God's paradise plan will be fulfilled, despite any present setbacks in the story. Now, God also used the word curse as a description for the catastrophe that he has just unleashed on the world. And of course, the word stands from the very beginning for God's active disapproval and opposition to evil. This is very clear. And he says it very straightforward like this: I will never again curse the ground because of humankind. For the inclination of the human heart is evil from youth, nor will I ever again destroy any living creature as I have done. So this action of God is apparently the last time God is going to reduce the living conditions on this planet. Enough is enough. The real point in the text is that such an action may stop evil. Yes, but it does not cure the problem of the human heart and mind. And I think here we are with the core of the issue of the story. We read this repeated: for the inclination of the human heart is evil from youth. And that raises the big question: what will God do in the future to stop evil when it breaks out in great scale? For he cannot reduce the living condition on this planet any further and still have a planet that is functioning. So how will he restrain the evil inclinations of the human hearts in the future? It looks as if God is running out of options, but according to the story, he chooses another strategy now. When we read on in the story, it appears that God will now build restraints into what we could call the human social order. This is where God now will work. Humans are actually giving a mandate to execute justice. We haven't heard that before. He says, whoever sheds the blood of humans, by humans shall that person's blood be shed. For in his own image God made humankind. So as far as God is concerned, you can't just go around and kill at large. You cannot murder at will, as Cain and Lamech were prepared to do, and as the last generation before the flood were doing. They were a generation of violent creatures. Actually an evil that caused God to pull the emergency brake in the first place. So here he's certainly giving the mandate to human to maintain justice in this world. That is not the way things were from the beginning, we should be aware of. It is still an emergency measure for humanity that has a deep inclination to evil. Nor will such measures ever cure the human spirit. This is very clear from the text too. But hopefully it may help to restrain human behavior, but it won't cure the problem. But God will do more. This is not the last action he takes as far as human society is concerned. He will do more to execute damage control, as we will read. As the story goes on, we read the following. Now this is post-flood, post-catastrophe. As the story goes on, we read, now the whole earth had one language, and the same words, and as they migrated from the east, they came upon a plain in the land of Shinar and settled there. Now, so when the family of Noah multiplied, well, they made collective plans to find a better place, a better living space than the one they had. This is not just another story of migration. So what are their plans? Let's read them. Come, let us build ourselves a city and a tower with its top in the heavens, and let us make a name for ourselves, otherwise we shall be scattered abroad upon the face of the whole earth. So they had no desire to spread out in different directions on the earth, and probably for very good reasons. This planet was now a very hostile and very difficult place to cultivate. So there were very good human reasons for not doing so. Instead, they planned to build a long-range enduring society. This is what they're up to. And they found a suitable place. The issue is the story that God has twice declared his plan for the world, that they should multiply and they should spread out and fill the earth. Instead, they come up with an alternative plan. A plan that in the eyes of God is a great evil. And we may wonder why this is the case. We read, "Look, they are one people and they have one language, and this is only the beginning. Or what they will do, nothing they propose to do will be impossible for them." Now the context for this statement is still that the human inclination of heart and mind is towards evil. And they plan to build an empire. Should we say one world, with one purpose and with one voice. And in the eyes of God, that would lead to an unstoppable evil. So what will God do? How will he execute damage control in this situation? So the next move on the side of God we read about, he will now decentralize what we could call human society by confusing their language. This is the next move of God. Come, let's go down and confuse their languages there, so they will not understand one another's speech. So the Lord scattered them abroad from there o'er the face of all the earth. And thus the empire building collapsed. Instead, the human family was now split into what we could call families, groups, tribes, and eventually nations. Competing and fighting with one another for the resources of this planet. Now, this is not, according to God's plan, something good. But it's the lesser of two evils in a world where the human heart is bent on evil. Their empire is split and weakened. So much for God's damage control, the curse. What about his promise of blessing? This is the other side of the story, or the other track of the Noah story. The hope that one day evil will be overcome, the human heart cured, and paradise life could return to this planet. What is God's next move in this matter? The world is now split into tribes, languages, and families. And what we will see is that God's next move is to build a nation and a people among the peoples. A nation and a people who, like a giant lighthouse, would enlighten the world and enlighten the world about God's future plan for the world. So the next step in God's plan or blessing story is the call of Abraham, the family of Abraham. We read the following. Now the Lord said to Abraham, "Go from your country and your kindred and your father's house, and the land that I will show to a land that I will show you." And this is where it all starts. Abraham was already on the path of migration when God is speaking these words to him. We often overlook that. He was already searching for another living place. And he was already migrating out of Chaldea when God approached him and said, "I will lead you to a new land." So what is God's plan for Abraham? What does he have in mind now? We read here, "I will make you a great nation, and I'll bless you and make your name great, so that you will be a blessing. In you all the families of the earth shall be blessed." That's a promise. That's what it is. God wants to bless the world. not curse the world. He wants, should I say, goodness, not evil. This is what God is up to. He has a promise plan here. God wants blessing and not curse. Curses are actions of damage control and restrains the evil inclination of the human heart, but they do not cure the problem. This we need to be aware of. This is what we learn in this story here. God wants blessing. If you imagine that you yourself was Abraham, what would you have heard when you heard a promise like that? Given the background story that Abraham may have lived with, about the confusion of languages, nations, God's restraining actions, what would he have heard? What would you have heard? Now imagine that the only thing you know is the story recorded in Genesis 1 to 11, the one we have been dealing with so far. We have not heard anything about what is going to come in the future. That's all we have. What do you have heard? What do you think Abraham would have heard? Now, where is the key to understanding the words of God to Abraham? How are we to interpret this? I've heard many different interpretations that are, and some of them or most of them are less biblical than others. But how do we understand this? This is the question of reading. It's the question of methods. Thus, our next presentation will focus on the Abraham story. And we will discuss the way we read. So welcome to the next presentation.